The Galactic Council had existed for 11,000 years. That was the first thing Ambassador Yara Osei learned when she stepped off the transit shuttle at Station Varanthus, a structure so vast it orbited no single star but instead drifted through the gravitational balance point of 3 systems simultaneously. The station was older than the Roman Empire. Older than written human language. Older than the agricultural revolution that had, in some indirect way, eventually produced Yara Osei herself, a 47-year-old career diplomat from Accra, Ghana, who had spent the last 6 years preparing for this exact moment. She did not feel ready. "Remember," said Director Callum Park over the comm earpiece as she walked the approach corridor, "we are observers only. Non-voting. The quorum made that very clear." "I remember," she said. "Do not speak unless spoken to. And if they speak to you, defer. We are newcomers." "I know, Callum." "Yara?" "I know." She did know. That was the agreed posture. Humanity had received its first verified alien contact 11 years ago, a navigational beacon near Saturn's magnetosphere, left there, it later turned out, by the Vedhari Collective as a kind of passive monitoring device. Not an invitation. A census marker. They had been watching Earth's electromagnetic output for roughly 2 centuries, categorizing humanity as a pre-contact civilization trending toward self-destruction probability class 3, likely extinction within 400 years, unlikely to develop faster than light travel, therefore low priority. Then humans developed the Alcubierre-Kessler drive in 2041, which was not supposed to happen. Not for another 1,000 years by Vedhari models. That had caused something the Vedhari apparently did not experience often: surprise. Contact was formalized 6 years later. A terse, carefully worded invitation had been extended. Humanity, unified under the new UN Interstellar Charter, sent its first diplomatic mission. 12 people. Yara among them. The council chamber was a sphere half a kilometer in diameter, its inner surface lined with tiered platforms, each occupied by a delegation. 17 species were represented. The Vedhari Collective, tall and bioluminescent, occupied the highest tier. The Drell Conclave, cephalopod adjacent, distributed intelligences housed in mobile tanks, occupied 3 adjacent platforms. The Surath Hegemony, avian and precise, their feathers folded tight in what Yara had learned indicated political tension. Humanity's platform was the smallest. It sat at the lowest tier near the entrance, structurally, symbolically at the bottom. The delegation had been briefed on this. It was not accidental. Sol System Delegation, announced the Chamber's translation system in a voice that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. Recognized as observational member, non-voting, provisional status pending full review. Yara took her seat. Beside her, Deputy Ambassador Reinhold Vast, a former Swedish military attaché, sat with the stillness of someone trained not to react. The rest of the team arranged themselves in the prescribed order. The session began. It concerned, of all things, a trade corridor dispute between the Vedhari Collective and the Surath Hegemony over transit rights through a nebula designated KX-7. A region that, Yara noted, lay directly along the most efficient vector between human space and the Outer Council territories. She listened carefully. She took notes. She said nothing. 3 hours in, the presiding arbiter, a being called Councillor Merith of the Drell Conclave, whose body was a soft mass of coordinated tissue moving slowly in a fluid-filled sphere, paused the formal proceedings and addressed the chamber generally. "Before we resume," Merith said, translated smoothly, "the floor has been requested for a secondary matter. A point of record." The chamber acknowledged. What came next was delivered without particular malice. That, in retrospect, was what made it so cutting. Councillor Previn of the Vedhari Collective, young by Vedhari standards, which meant roughly 400 years old, rose and spoke with the measured, clinical precision of someone presenting a zoological report. The sole delegation is noted as present. In the interest of procedural clarity, the collective wishes to formally enter into record the developmental classification of the Sol system's primary inhabitants. A pause for effect or perhaps for translation lag. Based on observed sociological data, resource allocation patterns, internal conflict indices and interfactional cohesion metrics over the last 2 centuries, the Sol species, self-designated as humans, have been assessed as a Category 2 emerging civilization. Notable for early technological acceleration, but structurally characterized by high fragmentation, historical aggression cycles, and institutional instability. Another pause. The collective notes, without prejudice, that the Sol species inclusion in this body is premature by standard council admittance criteria. Observational membership was extended as a diplomatic courtesy following their drive development. However, the collective believes the record should reflect that humanity does not yet meet the behavioral or structural thresholds for meaningful participation in interstellar governance. The chamber was quiet. Not the stunned quiet of an audience in shock, the practiced quiet of a body that had heard something like this before and was waiting to see how the subject responded. Yara Ose did not move. She was aware of Reinhold beside her, equally still. She was aware of her own breathing, steady and measured, a technique she had practiced under pressure since her first posting in Lagos during the 2029 water crisis, when the room she was negotiating in had lost power and both delegations had sat in the dark for 40 minutes waiting to see who would speak first. She had waited then too. Previn continued. The collective does not recommend exclusion, only accurate categorization. The Council may find it useful, when discussing matters of strategic or territorial significance, to note that human institutional capacity remains sub-threshold for treaty reliability. Translation: don't make binding agreements with them. They won't hold. Yara's earpiece crackled. Callum again from the monitoring room. Yara. Protocol says we observe. Do not respond. She reached up and very quietly turned the earpiece off. She stood. It was not dramatic. She rose the way a person rises when they have decided something rather than when they are reacting to something. Slowly, deliberately, without haste. Several of the delegations turned. The Surith feathers shifted. The Drell Conclave's representative dimmed slightly, then brightened. Councillor Previn, Yara said. Her voice was even. The translation system rendered it in 17 languages simultaneously. Previn regarded her with the particular stillness of a being who had not expected to be addressed. You've entered an assessment into the record, Yara said. I'd like to enter a response. A beat. We are an observational member, Previn said. Without floor rights. You addressed us directly in a public session, Yara replied. By council convention that grants right of reply. I've read your procedural charter, Councillor. All 11,000 years of it. The chamber was quiet in a different way now. Marith, the arbiter, moved slowly in his fluid sphere. The sole delegate has right of reply. 2 minutes, standard. Yara nodded once. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform indignation. She spoke the way she always spoke when she had something real to say, directly, precisely, without theater. Thank you, Councillor. The assessment you've entered is based on data that is between 40 and 200 years old. In that time, humanity has done the following. Unified 6 previously antagonistic governmental blocks under a single interstellar charter, reduced internal armed conflict by 73%, developed a faster-than-light drive in approximately 1/9 the projected timeline, and sent a diplomatic delegation to this chamber rather than a military one, which, given our history, I think you'll agree was not the inevitable outcome. She let that sit for a moment. You are correct that we are new here. You are correct that we have a complicated past. But I'd suggest that accurately characterizing any civilization requires looking at its trajectory, not just its history. And our trajectory, Councillor, is worth paying attention to. She sat down. The session resumed 20 minutes later. Nothing was formally acknowledged. No vote was taken. No one from the other delegations spoke to her afterward. But the Surith hegemony's lead delegate, an avian elder named Tessavar, whose feathers had been folded tight with tension for most of the session, extended one wing briefly as Yara passed on the way out. A gesture her cultural briefing files had identified as, noted with interest. Back on the transit shuttle, Callum Park's first words were, "You turned off your earpiece." "The channel had interference," Yara said. He looked at her for a long moment. "The Council's Internal Communications Board flagged your reply within 6 minutes," he said. "It's already been logged, translated, and distributed to 14 member delegations." "Good," she said. "Yara. This could complicate everything." She looked out the viewport at Station Varanthus. 11,000 years of interstellar order, hanging in the dark between 3 stars. Or, she said quietly, it could be the beginning of something. She didn't say it with certainty. She wasn't certain. She was a diplomat, not a prophet. But she had learned, in 30 years of negotiating rooms, that the moment someone underestimates you out loud, that is the moment the dynamic shifts. The Vedhari Collective had just done that. In front of 17 civilizations. Whatever came next would be humanity's answer. The transcript reached Earth in 14 hours. Not because the signal was slow. The quantum relay network the Vedhari had built across their territorial expanse was extraordinarily fast, but because the UN Interstellar Secretariat had 3 separate verification protocols that required sequential human review before any Council communication could be classified, distributed, and acted upon. This was intentional. In the early years of contact, Earth's leadership had learned a painful lesson about reacting to interstellar information before it was fully understood. The lesson had come from a mistranslation in 2046, when an automated Vedhari diplomatic ping had been partially interpreted as a territorial warning, prompting a 2-week militarized response posture that had nearly unraveled the contact relationship entirely. Since then, all Council communications went through the Linguistic Verification Office, the Interstellar Intelligence Assessment Bureau, and the Secretary-General's Strategic Reading Group before any institutional response was authorized. 14 hours, therefore, was fast. Secretary-General Dmitry Vasilenko read the transcript in his office in Geneva at 0340 local time, having been woken by his chief of staff 20 minutes earlier. He read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk and sat quietly for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. "Get me Admiral Chen," he said finally. "And the Foreign Affairs Council. And Yara." His chief of staff, a young man from Manila named Arjun who had the useful quality of never appearing alarmed, said simply, "Yes, sir." The call convened at 0500. 17 people in the room, 6 more on secure link from Washington, Beijing, New Delhi, and Nairobi. Yara Osei appeared on screen from the diplomatic transit hub at Proxima Station, tired but composed. Vasilenko did not open with pleasantries. "Talk to me about the long-term implications," he said. What followed was 3 hours of careful, methodical analysis. The kind of conversation that never appears in popular accounts of first contact history because it consists largely of people saying things like "on the other hand" and "we should be careful not to assume" and "what's the second-order effect here?" It was not dramatic. It was the work. The consensus that emerged was nuanced and uncomfortable. On one hand, Councillor Previn's statement was legally an internal council matter. The Vedhari Collective had entered an assessment, not a resolution. No binding decision had been made. Humanity's observational membership remained intact. Technically nothing had changed. On the other hand, and this was the part that kept senior officials up at night for weeks afterward, what Previn had done was frame humanity publicly and formally within the Council's institutional memory. The Council's records were permanent. 11,000 years of procedural archive, consulted constantly by member delegations when making decisions about trade routes, treaty partnerships, territorial negotiations, and security arrangements. Humanity had now been entered into that archive as subthreshold for treaty reliability. Admiral Liang Qin, commander of the UN Interstellar Defense Command, put it plainly about 90 minutes into the meeting. "They didn't insult us," she said. "They categorized us. And in their system that's worse. Categories persist. Insults fade." She was right and everyone in the room knew it. The question was what to do about it. Several options were considered. The most cautious was to do nothing. Accept the categorization, continue building the relationship slowly, and allow humanity's actual behavior over time to correct the record organically. This was the position favored by several senior diplomats, including Deputy Ambassador Reinhold Vast, who argued that any confrontational response would validate Previn's characterization of humanity as institutionally unstable. The second option was a formal diplomatic protest, a carefully worded document filed through Council procedures, requesting that the assessment be reviewed, contextualized, or removed. This had procedural merit, but the Legal Analysis Office pointed out that the protest itself would be added to the same permanent archive, creating a record of humanity objecting to an accurate procedural categorization, which might read as defensiveness rather than competence. The third option was what Admiral Chen called demonstrating the assessment wrong. Not through argument but through action. "They said we're fragmented, aggressive, and institutionally unreliable," Chen said, her voice level. "So we stop being those things, visibly, measurably, and in ways the Council can observe. We don't fight the categorization. We make it obsolete." This was harder than it sounded. Structural change in human institutions, even motivated structural change with genuine political will behind it, takes time. The UN Interstellar Charter had been a historic achievement, but humanity's various regional governments still maintained independent military assets, independent economic policies, and independent foreign affairs bureaus. True unified interstellar posture was still more aspiration than reality. But it was in the process of becoming real. The Alcubierre-Kessler drive had, perhaps more than any other single development, accelerated humanity's political unification. When FTL travel became possible, the strategic calculus shifted fundamentally. A dispute between two Earth-based nations suddenly had interstellar implications. If one faction compromised humanity's standing with the Council, everyone suffered. The pressure toward genuine coherence was no longer idealistic. It was practical. Vasilenko made his decision by 0800. "We respond on two tracks," he said. "Diplomatically, Ambassador Osei has already made our position clear in chambers. We don't repeat it. We don't amplify it. We let it stand as the record." He looked at Yara's image on screen. "That was well done, by the way." Yara nodded once. "Structurally, we accelerate the integration timeline. Admiral Chin, I want a unified command structure for all interstellar assets within 18 months. Director Park, I want the treaty reliability question addressed directly. We'll open binding arbitration on the KX-7 corridor as a gesture of good faith toward the Suruth, demonstrating that we can be a stable treaty partner. And I want that filed with the Council within 60 days. He paused. "And I want it filed not as a response to Previn's assessment. Filed as routine interstellar diplomacy. No commentary. No reference to the incident. We simply begin behaving at the level they said we couldn't." It was, in retrospect, exactly the right call. But the implications of Previn's statement continued to ripple outward in ways that no one in Geneva had fully anticipated. The most significant ripple was not political. It was social. The transcript had been classified, but classification of Council communications in the UN interstellar system lasted exactly 72 hours before automatic declassification protocols released them to the public archive. This was a transparency measure adopted after the 2046 incident. It was good governance. It was also, in this case, a stone dropped into very still water. By the time the 72-hour clock ran out, someone in the Linguistic Verification Office had already leaked a summary to 3 independent journalists. It spread in roughly 4 hours. By the time official declassification occurred, it had already reached every major media platform on Earth, the Proxima Colony, the Mars Administrative Region, and the 6 deep space research stations currently operational. The framing varied by outlet, but the core fact was consistent. An alien government had officially declared, in front of the entire Galactic Council, that humanity was not trustworthy enough to participate in interstellar governance. The response was not what some officials feared: mass panic, political destabilization, anti-alien sentiment. It was something quieter and in some ways more powerful. It was recognition. Humans, broadly, had a complicated relationship with the idea of their own civilization. The 21st century had not been easy. Climate disruption, political fragmentation, economic inequality, and the near miss of several catastrophic conflicts had left a generation of people who were simultaneously proud of human achievement and genuinely uncertain whether the species was going to make it. Previn's assessment, clinical, alien, delivered from 11,000 years of institutional authority, had somehow crystallized something that humanity had not quite said clearly to itself. An outside civilization with no emotional stake in the outcome had looked at human history and said, "We're not sure you're going to hold together." And rather than being crushed by that, something interesting happened. People got angry. Not at the aliens. At the idea of proving them right. In Seoul, a 24-year-old engineering student named Minjun Lee, who had been studying interstellar propulsion systems, posted a single line that was reshared 400 million times in the first week. They said, "We're not ready." Fine. Let's get ready. It was not policy. It was not a diplomatic strategy. It was not even particularly original as a sentiment. But it captured something real about the moment humanity found itself in. A species that had been told, clearly and officially, that the rest of the galaxy wasn't sure it could be trusted. And that was, in the end, exactly the kind of challenge that human beings had historically responded to in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. The integration directive was not announced with fanfare. It was published on a Tuesday morning, UN Interstellar Secretariat Press Release 2057-441, buried in a document cycle that also included routine updates on Proxima Colony water reclamation infrastructure, a revised schedule for deep space relay maintenance, and a procedural note about changes to the Council submission format. Deliberately buried. Secretary General Vasilenko had been explicit about that. "We are not performing strength," he had told his communications team the night before. "We are exercising it." The integration directive did 3 things. First, it formalized the unified command structure for all UN-flagged interstellar military assets under a single operational authority, the newly designated Interstellar Defense Coordination Command (IDCC), with Admiral Liang Chen as its first commander. Second, It established binding arbitration protocols between Earth's major regional governments for any dispute that carried interstellar implications, removing the scenario in which a bilateral conflict on Earth could compromise humanity's posture at the Council. Third, it committed humanity to a new treaty framework, the Interstellar Reliability Compact, that would be offered to any Council member willing to co-sign, providing a structured, verifiable mechanism for trade agreements, navigational rights, and conflict resolution. All three measures had been in various stages of development for years. The directive accelerated them. More precisely, it made them politically inevitable by tying them together in a single document with a clear implementation timeline and specific accountability mechanisms. Admiral Chen gave an interview a week later, her only public statement on the period, in which she said something that became widely quoted: "The question was never whether we were capable of this. The question was whether we had a reason urgent enough to stop postponing it." The Vedhari assessment had been that reason. The IDCC's first task was an audit. Not a combat readiness audit, a capability audit. What did humanity actually have, and where was it, and what could it realistically do? The answer was both more and less than most people assumed. More because the public generally underestimated how aggressively humanity had been building interstellar infrastructure since the Alcubierre-Kessler drive became operational. The drive itself was not a weapon. It was a logistics system. But logistics at interstellar scale is what determines everything else. A civilization that can move people and materials across light years reliably and repeatedly is a civilization with genuine strategic depth. Humanity had been doing this for 15 years, quietly and with the particular intensity of a species that had been told it was running out of time. The fleet, if it could be called that at this stage, consisted of 41 operational FTL-capable vessels. Of those, 28 were commercial or research vessels with limited defensive systems. 11 were purpose-built military ships, designated deep space response vessels, capable of long-range autonomous operation with substantial sensor and defensive suites. 2 were in a category that the IDCC's audit simply labeled experimental and declined to elaborate on in the unclassified summary. Less because the audit also revealed significant gaps. Communications infrastructure beyond Proxima was inconsistent. Supply chain security for extended military operations beyond 2 light-years was unproven. And perhaps most critically, humanity had no real intelligence capability within the Council's territorial space. No understanding of the political relationships between member civilizations, no insight into which delegations might be sympathetic, and no reliable assessment of what the Vedhari Collective's actual intentions were. This last gap was what kept Admiral Chen working late most nights. The Vedhari Collective was not a simple adversary. They were not, as far as any intelligence assessment could determine, hostile to humanity in any active sense. They were, the analysts believed, genuinely indifferent. A civilization so old and so established that a new species developing FTL capability was an interesting data point rather than a threat. Preven's statement in chambers had almost certainly been policy, not aggression. An official position carefully considered. That was, in some ways, harder to deal with than hostility. Hostility could be countered, negotiated with, deterred. Indifference required something else entirely. It required becoming important enough to pay attention to. The intelligence gap began to close through an unlikely channel. Ambassador Tessevar of the Surith hegemony, the avian elder who had offered Yara that small gesture of acknowledgement after the chamber's session, made contact through a back-channel diplomatic protocol that the Surith apparently reserved for communications they did not want formally logged in the Council archive. The message was brief and required 3 layers of translation to render fully into English. The substance, as best Yara's team could interpret it, was this. The Surith hegemony had its own complicated history with the Vedhari Collective. The hegemony was one of the older council members, predating Vedhari dominance, and the relationship between the two civilizations was layered with old agreements, older grievances, and a power dynamic that had shifted over millennia in ways that still generated friction. Tessevar was not offering an alliance. The message was careful to make that clear. But he was suggesting that the Surith found humanity's situation familiar in certain respects, and that there might be value in a more substantive private conversation. Yara recommended accepting. Vasilenko agreed. The meeting took place at a neutral way station near the edge of Surith territorial space, a 7-day transit from Earth even at FTL speeds, and it lasted 4 days. Yara brought 3 advisors and a cultural liaison. Tessevar brought 2 senior policy architects and an archivist. What the archivist brought was, quietly, the most valuable thing that had happened to human interstellar relations since first contact. The Surith maintained their own archive, distinct from the Council's central record, going back further than the Council itself, encompassing their observations of 8 civilizations that had gone through the process of Council admittance over the past 4,000 years. 6 of those civilizations were now full voting members. 1 had declined full membership and maintained a trade-only relationship with the Council. 1 had been expelled. The Surith archivist, with Tessavar's authorization, walked Yara's team through the patterns. Every civilization that achieved full Council membership, the archive showed, had at some point faced a formal characterization challenge, a point at which an existing member had questioned their readiness or reliability. It was not codified in the Council's official procedures, but it was consistent in practice. The archivist used a word that translated roughly as threshold test, not an official process but a cultural one. A new civilization's response to being publicly questioned determined, in the eyes of long-established members, whether they were worth engaging with seriously. 5 of the 6 successful Council members had responded to their threshold tests the same way. Not with anger. Not with withdrawal. With measurable, sustained structural change, the kind that could be observed externally, logged and verified over time. Yara listened to this for 3 hours, and then asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the Council chamber. How long did it take them? The ones that made it through. The archivist considered the translation carefully. The fastest was 12 years, he said. The slowest was 90. The average was approximately 40. Yara was quiet for a moment. We have time, she said. But not unlimited time. Tessavar, who had been listening with the particular stillness of his species, tilted his head at an angle that Yara's cultural briefing identified as considered agreement. No, he said. Not unlimited. The KX-7 corridor dispute was still unresolved when Yara returned to Earth. But 2 things had happened during her absence that changed the shape of the problem. Admiral Chen's IDCC had quietly begun conducting navigational surveys of the KX-7 nebula, operating within what the Council's territorial charter designated as unclaimed transit space, which was legally unambiguous but politically pointed. The surveys were scientific in declared purpose. They were also generating the kind of detailed navigational data that would be essential if humanity ever needed to move assets through that region quickly. And in Brussels, the first meeting of the Interstellar Reliability Compact Working Group had taken place, attended by representatives from 31 Earth governments plus the Proxima Colony Administration. The compact was not yet signed, but the working group had met, and met again the following week. Small things. Individually unremarkable. Together, they were the quiet architecture of a civilization deciding to take itself seriously. Preven's assessment had said humanity was characterized by fragmentation and instability. The Integration Directive, the IDCC, the Surith Channel, the KX-7 surveys, the Compact Working Group, none of these were responses to Preven specifically. They were responses to reality. To the honest recognition that if humanity wanted to matter in the galaxy, it would have to build something worth matching with. That was not arrogance. It was not defiance. It was the oldest human impulse of all. Someone had said, "You can't." And quietly, without announcement, humanity had begun proving otherwise. The navigational surveys of the KX-7 nebula were still in progress when the Vethari Collective filed a formal territorial notice with the Council. It was not a declaration of exclusion. The Council's charter was explicit that nebular transit space could not be claimed without a settlement presence. But it was a formal assertion of navigational priority, meaning that the Vethari considered the KX-7 corridor a controlled transit lane subject to their approval for passage. The notice was filed precisely, correctly, and was entirely within the procedural boundaries of Council law. It was also, by any reasonable reading, aimed directly at humanity. The timing was not subtle. The Vethari notice was filed 11 days after the IDCC survey vessels entered the region, and 3 days after the UN Secretariat formally submitted the Interstellar Reliability Compact to the Council as a proposed multilateral framework. The compact had named the KX-7 corridor specifically as a case study for how binding arbitration between Council members could resolve territorial disputes without escalation. Preven's office issued no statement. They didn't need to. The notice said everything. Admiral Chen's assessment, delivered to Vasilenko in a secure brief that same evening, was characteristically direct. "They're not blocking us," she said. "They're testing us." The notice has no legal enforcement mechanism in unclaimed transit space. The charter is clear on that. If we continue the surveys, they can protest but not act. If we withdraw, we've demonstrated that we'll yield to procedural pressure without a legal basis for doing so. Which, incidentally, would validate their treaty reliability argument. And if we stay? Vasilenko asked. Then we're in a standoff in a nebula with a civilization that's been doing interstellar politics for 11,000 years. Options. Chin had 3. Option 1. Withdraw the survey vessels and file a formal legal challenge through council procedures, arguing that the navigational priority notice was procedurally improper in unclaimed transit space. This was safe, defensible, and slow. Legal challenges through the council moved on timescales measured in years. Option 2. Maintain the survey vessels and say nothing. No response to the notice, no public statement, simply continue operating within legal rights while the Vethari and the rest of the council watched to see what happened. Option 3 was the one Chin preferred, and had spent 3 days developing. We offer to turn the surveys into a joint scientific mission, she said. Open the navigational data to any council member that wants to co-participate. Include the Vethari. Include the Surath. Frame it as a contribution to council navigational infrastructure. We're not claiming anything, we're building something that benefits everyone. Vasilenko looked at her. They won't accept. Almost certainly not, Chin agreed. But the offer is on record. And every delegation watching will note that our first response to a territorial pressure was a collaborative proposal, not a countermove. Yara, joining by link from Proxima Station, added, it also puts the Vethari in an uncomfortable position. If they reject a good-faith scientific collaboration offer, they have to explain that to the Surath, the Drell, and every other council member who has navigational interest in the KX-7 region. The corridor matters to a lot of species. We're not the only ones who'd benefit from better survey data. The joint mission proposal was transmitted to the council within 36 hours, addressed not to the Vethari specifically but to the full council membership. It was formal, precise, and thoroughly documented, the kind of proposal that had clearly been produced by an institution with functioning internal processes. 7 council delegations responded positively within 2 weeks. The Vethari did not respond at all, which, the council observers noted in their own internal communications, was itself a kind of answer. The Drell conclave, whose presiding arbiter, Marith, had given Yara the floor in the chamber's session, sent a private message through diplomatic channels that translated roughly as, the proposal demonstrates appropriate understanding of collective process. This was, by Drell communication standards, effusive praise. The KX-7 joint mission launched 4 months later with survey vessels from Humanity, the Surath Hegemony, the Drell Conclave, and 2 smaller council members who had navigational claims in the region. It was not a military operation. It was not a political statement. It was, precisely as advertised, a scientific survey. But it was humanity's first collaborative operation with other interstellar civilizations. And it ran on human organizational protocols, coordinated by an IDCC logistics team that, under Admiral Chen's direction, had spent 3 months preparing for exactly this kind of multinational coordination. It ran smoothly. Not perfectly, there were communication delays, translation ambiguities, and one significant incident in which a Surath vessel's navigational system flagged a human probe as an anomalous object and went to passive alert posture before the misidentification was resolved. But it ran. 4 species, for different technological traditions, for different organizational cultures, operating in shared space toward a shared goal. When the mission concluded 8 weeks later, it had produced the most comprehensive navigational chart of the KX-7 nebula in the Council's archive. The data was shared with all participating delegations and filed with the Council's Navigational Infrastructure Office as a public record. The Vethari filed no further territorial notices. They also sent no acknowledgement, no communication, and no response of any kind to the joint mission or its results. Yara was not surprised. She had spent enough time studying the Vethari to understand something important about them. They were not, at their core, adversarial. They were institutional. 11,000 years of being the dominant force in a governance structure had made them deeply invested in that structure's rules and norms, invested to the point that anything which operated cleanly within those rules was, for the Vethari, somewhat difficult to object to. Humanity had just spent 8 weeks demonstrating that it could operate cleanly within the rules. What the KX-7 mission produced strategically, beyond the navigational data, was credibility. Not grand, dramatic, headline-generating credibility. The quiet kind. The kind that comes from watching an institution perform well under pressure over time. 3 council delegations that had previously abstained from contact with the human mission began scheduling diplomatic meetings within the following year. Meanwhile, the IDCC's capability audit had continued, and its conclusions were sharpening. Humanity's 11 military-rated vessels were, by Council standards, not impressive. The Vedhari collective alone maintained over 300 defense-rated ships, and several other member civilizations had comparable fleets. The raw numbers were not in humanity's favor. But numbers, Admiral Chen kept reminding her staff, were not the whole picture. Human ships were newer. They incorporated the Alcubierre-Kessler drive in configurations that no other civilization had yet matched for efficiency and range. The newest DSRV-class vessels, the Deep Space Response vessels, could sustain FTL travel at ranges that, according to the Council's own navigational standards, significantly exceeded the interstellar capability of most member fleets. Not because humanity was more advanced. Because the Alcubierre-Kessler drive had been a genuine physics breakthrough, not an incremental improvement on existing technology. The Vethari's FTL systems, the Suruthas, the Drells, all were variants of a drive architecture that was at its core 3,000 years old. They were exquisitely refined, extraordinarily reliable, deeply integrated into those civilizations' infrastructure. They were also, in one specific and important dimension, limited. Human FTL was not faster, but it was more flexible, capable of operating in gravitational environments that older drive architectures required significant transit margins to navigate safely. The KX-7 Nebula was one such environment. The navigational priority notice the Vedhari had filed was, the IDCC analysts realized in retrospect, partly about the fact that human survey vessels had simply gone places in that nebula that Vedhari ships would have required much longer approach vectors to reach. Preven's assessment had called humanity technologically accelerated but strategically immature. The second part might have been accurate at the time of the assessment. It was becoming less accurate by the month. Arbiter Marith of the Drell Conclave did not communicate through conventional diplomatic channels. This was not obstruction. It was biology. The Drell were distributed intelligences. A single Drell entity was, in the most accurate translation available, a consensus of approximately 40 to 60 semi-autonomous cognitive nodes, collectively housed in a fluid medium and capable of local coordination through a form of chemical and electrical signaling that human neuroscience found genuinely remarkable. What this meant practically was that a Drell's communication was never the output of a single mind, but of a negotiated internal process that operated on timescales humans experienced as unusually deliberate. Maritha's responses to diplomatic queries typically took 3 to 7 days. Not because the Drell were slow, their processing capability by any measure exceeded human cognitive benchmarks considerably, but because Marith considered every response to be a policy position, and policy positions required internal consensus. When Marith sent a personal diplomatic contact to the human mission within 9 days of the KX-7 joint mission completing, it was, by Drell standards, essentially immediate. The message, once translated through 4 interpretive layers, was an invitation. Not to a formal diplomatic session. To an educational exchange. The Drell Conclave maintained what translated most accurately as a living archive, not a digital record system, but a community of elder Drell entities who had participated directly in Council history over centuries and whose individual memories constituted the Conclave's institutional knowledge. The invitation was to send human representatives to spend time with this archive. To ask questions. To learn. Yara consulted with Vasilenko before responding. Their exchange, recorded in the diplomatic log, was brief. Vasilenko, what do they want in return? Yara, I don't know yet. But I think we should go find out. She brought 4 people. Herself, a xenosociologist named Dr. Amara Diallo from the University of Lagos Interstellar Studies Program, a military intelligence analyst named Captain Sung-Ho Park, no relation to Director Callum Park, and a young Drell language specialist from the Translation Institute named Fatou Bald, who was, at 26, the world's leading human expert on Drell communicative structure and had spent 3 years developing the interpretive framework that made Maritha's communications comprehensible at all. The Drell Conclave's primary habitat was a water world in a system 2 light-years beyond the Council's main territorial boundary, a place the Drell had occupied for, by their own account, 6,000 years. It was not what Yara had expected. She had formed a mental image of something alien and stark. What she found was, in the most literal possible sense, alive. The world's oceans covered 94% of its surface. The Drell lived throughout those oceans, their habitats distributed across thousands of kilometers of warm, mineral-rich water. There were no cities in any human sense. There were concentrations, places where Drell entities gathered in larger numbers, where the cognitive density of the collective was highest. The diplomatic meeting point was one such concentration, a subsurface platform that the Drell maintained specifically for contact with non-aquatic visitors. Marith greeted them there. The greeting itself took 40 minutes by human perception. By Drell convention this was brief. The exchange that followed over the next 6 days would later be described by Dr. Diallo as the most intensive diplomatic education of her career. The Elder Archive entities communicated in layers: historical context, procedural precedent, cultural subtext, and direct information simultaneously. Fatou Bald was stretched to her absolute limits translating, and at several points asked for extended pauses to ensure she was rendering the layers accurately rather than collapsing them into simpler statements that might misrepresent the Drell's meaning. What humanity learned in those 6 days was substantial. The Drell had been a founding member of the Galactic Council. They had helped write its original charter and had participated in every major institutional revision since. They were also, currently, in a period of what they described as governance concern, a term that translated, in context, as something between frustration and institutional anxiety. The Council, as the Drell saw it, had developed a structural rigidity over the past several centuries that was hampering its ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Several member civilizations had declined in capability and were maintaining full voting seats on inertia rather than genuine interstellar capacity. Conversely, new civilizations, including humanity, were developing faster than the Council's admittance framework was designed to accommodate. The Drell had been advocating internally for institutional reform for approximately 200 years. They had made limited progress. Preven's statement about humanity from the Drell perspective was a symptom of a larger problem. The Council's dominant members, particularly the Vedhari, were using procedural categorization to maintain a status quo that served their interests rather than the collective good of the Council as a whole. This was not conspiracy. The Drell were explicit that they did not attribute malicious intent to the Vedhari. It was institutional conservatism. The Vedhari had built the current order and naturally were inclined to preserve it. What the Drell wanted from humanity was, in essence, an example. Not a confrontation with the Vedhari. Not a destabilizing challenge to Council authority. A demonstration, visible, sustained, and documented in the Council's own permanent record, that a new civilization could develop at a pace that the Council's framework hadn't anticipated, and could do so while operating within the rules with sufficient competence that the existing framework for characterizing new civilizations would have to be revisited. "You are not our instrument," Marith said, or the consensus of his nodes communicated, through Fatou's translation. "That would be inappropriate and we do not intend it. But your situation is useful. If you manage it well, it makes an argument we have been unable to make alone." Yara asked the obvious question. "What do you consider managing it well?" Marith's response took 2 days. The substance, when it arrived, was a detailed framework, not a prescription but an analysis. The Drell had watched 17 civilizations go through Council admittance over their 6,000 years of membership. They had data on what worked and what didn't, what the Council's dominant members actually responded to, and what humanity's specific advantages and liabilities were in the current political environment. The advantages were clearer than Yara had expected. The Alcubierre-Kessler drive's flexibility gave humanity genuine strategic value in the KX-7 region and several other contested transit corridors. The integration momentum following the directive had been noted by multiple Council delegations. And the joint mission had demonstrated multinational coordination capacity in a way that was difficult to dismiss. The liabilities were also clearer. Humanity's internal political unification was still incomplete. The Interstellar Reliability Compact had 31 signatories but needed to demonstrate sustained compliance before it meant anything. And perhaps most significantly, human intelligence capability within Council space was still embryonic. The Suryth channel was valuable but narrow, and there were 17 Council members whose positions and intentions remained largely opaque. "You are credible," Marith's message said. "You are not yet reliable. There is a difference and the Council knows it." Captain Sung-Ho Park, the intelligence analyst, spent most of the return transit from the Drell world writing a classified assessment that reached Chen and Vasilenko within a week of landing. Its executive summary was 6 lines. "The Drell conclave represents the most significant strategic relationship opportunity we have encountered. They are not offering alliance. Their institutional position within the Council prevents that. But they are offering something more valuable. An inside understanding of how the Council actually works as distinct from how its charter says it works. We should invest heavily in this relationship. The cost of doing so is sustained, visible institutional performance. The Drell are not interested in words. They are interested in patterns over time. We should also be aware that we are now, at minimum, an interesting variable in a political dynamic that has been running for centuries. This is not necessarily dangerous. But it is complex and we should proceed accordingly. The KX-7 mission was the right first move. We need more of them. Chin read the assessment and called Park directly. What's your read on the Vedhari? She asked. Park considered. They know we met with the Drell. They'll have drawn conclusions. The question is whether they read it as us building a coalition against them, or as us learning how to function in the Council's environment. Which is it? Both, Park said. Which is actually useful. It means they have to decide whether to engage with us more directly, or continue treating us as a categorization problem. And every time they choose the second option, they look less like a governance institution and more like a bloc protecting its own interests. Chin was quiet for a moment. And if they choose the first option? She asked. Then we have a conversation, Park said. Which is what we want. It would be another 8 months before that conversation happened. And it would not begin the way anyone anticipated. The distress signal came from Vareth Station at 0317 UTC on March 14, 2059. Vareth Station was a Vedhari administrative hub, a mid-sized facility serving roughly 40,000 inhabitants, situated at a navigational junction point between 3 major council transit lanes. It was not a military installation. It was closer in function to a port authority. Customs processing, navigational registration, trade documentation, and transit coordination for the 8 species whose commercial traffic moved through that junction daily. The distress signal was technically classified as a navigational emergency. The station's primary structural integrity system had suffered a catastrophic cascade failure, likely triggered by a micrometeorite strike that had breached a poorly monitored section of the outer hull and initiated a pressure loss sequence in 3 of the station's 7 habitation rings. The station's own emergency systems were functional but overtaxed. 2 of the habitation rings were actively venting atmosphere. Evacuation capacity was sufficient for approximately 60% of the station's population before the structural situation became critical. The signal went to the Council's Emergency Coordination Office as required by interstellar maritime law, a body that maintained a roster of member civilizations with rapid response capability in each major transit region. Humanity was not on that roster. The nearest council member with listed emergency response capability in the Vareth region was the Surath Hegemony, but their nearest response asset was 14 hours transit away at standard Surath FTL velocities. The second nearest was the Vedhari Collective's own fleet, paradoxically constrained by the same gravitational environment that made the Vareth junction strategically significant and difficult to approach at high speed. Their fastest projected response time to a full evacuation posture was 11 hours. 2 habitation rings were venting atmosphere. The station had roughly 6 hours. IDCC's Tactical Operations Center received the distress signal through the Council's emergency broadcast system, a standard monitoring function that Chin had established as routine after the KX-7 joint mission. The night duty officer, a lieutenant commander named Priya Kapoor, ran the response time calculations twice, confirmed them with the duty analyst, and woke Chin at 0341. Chin was at the operations center by 0400. She had reviewed the situation summary, the navigation data, and the response roster gap by 0415. At 0417 she called Vasilenko. We have a DSV in the region, she said. The Meridian. It's on a survey tasking 40 minutes transit from Vareth at Alcubierre speed. I want to reroute. Vasilenko was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. She counted later, reviewing the call log. Legal status? He asked. The Council's Emergency Maritime Charter allows non-roster responders to engage if they're the fastest available asset and the emergency is confirmed. We qualify on both. I'll have legal review it within the hour, but the reading is clean. What's on the Meridian? Crew of 22. Search and rescue qualified. She's configured for survey work, but she's got full medical bay and can shuttle approximately 200 people per trip at emergency density. How many trips to cover 40,000 people? We can't cover 40,000 people alone, Chin said. But we can cover the ones in the venting rings, estimated 8,000, before anyone else arrives. The Surath and the Vedhari cover the rest. Vasilenko didn't hesitate. Do it, he said. An Liang, make sure the Meridian's communications are fully open to the Council emergency channel. Everything we do they see in real time. Chin noted the wisdom of that instruction and moved. Commander Yolanda Ferreira of the IDSV Meridian received her orders at 0423 and had the ship at FTL within 6 minutes. Her crew, survey scientists, technical staff, and the small emergency response team that every DSRV-class vessel carried by standard IDCC protocol, had drilled for mass casualty response twice in the past year. They had never done it for real. They were now. The Meridian arrived at Verith Station at 0511. What followed was 9 hours of sustained, difficult, occasionally chaotic work. The station's external docking systems on the compromised rings were partially functional, enough to allow hard seal boarding rather than the slower process of external evacuation. Ferreira's emergency team, working with the station's own emergency coordinators through translation software that occasionally lagged at the worst possible moments, established a priority triage system. Mobile individuals first, then assisted mobility, then those requiring medical intervention to move. The Meridian made 4 transit runs to the nearest stable way station, each carrying 180 to 220 people. On the third run, the atmospheric loss in Ring 3 accelerated faster than the structural models had projected, and the decision was made to close the evacuation corridor and seal the ring with 140 people still inside. Those 140 were moved to pressurized emergency refuges by the station's own emergency teams, a contingency that worked barely because the refuges held. No one died. By the time the Surith response vessel arrived at Verith Station and the Vedhari emergency fleet reached maneuvering range 6 hours later, the Meridian's crew had evacuated 847 people from the 2 compromised habitation rings and the station's structural situation had stabilized enough for permanent repair teams to begin work. Commander Ferreira's after-action report noted that her crew had operated for 9 hours in conditions that included atmosphere loss, structural instability, translation failures, and the particular psychological complexity of evacuating people who were frightened, unfamiliar with human beings, and in some cases initially unwilling to board a human vessel. That last detail appeared in the report as a single, dry line: cultural confidence building required during boarding stages. What it meant in practice was that Ferreira's medical officer, a young doctor from Cape Town named Dr. James Okafor, had spent the first 40 minutes of the operation doing nothing except being visible, calm, helpful, and non-threatening, standing at the boarding corridor in full suit with his visor open, helping people across the gap by hand, saying nothing that the translation system couldn't handle, and demonstrating through patient repetition that the humans on this ship were not something to fear. It worked. After the first group crossed successfully and the word spread through the station's communication network, the evacuation boarding rate approximately doubled. The Council's Emergency Coordination Office filed its incident report 5 days later. The report was formal, technical, and thorough. Its final paragraph, under the heading Response Assessment, noted that the IDSV Meridian had arrived first, operated effectively within Council emergency maritime protocols, coordinated appropriately with subsequent responders, and demonstrated command-level organizational capacity consistent with established interstellar emergency response standards. It was the first time any UN interstellar asset had been formally assessed by a Council body against established standards. The assessment was consistent with established standards. Not exceptional. Not remarkable. Not praised. Consistent. Yara, reading the report from her office at the Proxima Diplomatic Hub, actually laughed when she got to that line. Not bitterly. The Council's language stripped emotion out of everything. Consistent with established standards was, from an institution 11,000 years old, a serious acknowledgement. Preven's office sent no communication. But 11 days after the Verith incident, the Vedhari Collective quietly filed an amendment to the Council's emergency response roster, adding, without explanation or commentary, the IDSV Meridian and the IDSV Kepler to the recognized rapid response list for 2 transit regions, including the KX-7 corridor. Yara saw the filing and called Chin immediately. "They added us to the roster," she said. "I saw," Chin said. "Without any communication. No note. No acknowledgement of the incident." "No," Chin agreed. "That's very Vedhari." "Very," Chin said. There was a pause. "But they did it." Yara was quiet for a moment. "How's the Meridian crew?" she asked. "Home," Chin said. "They're all home." Ferreira put in for leave for her whole team. "I approved it before she finished the sentence." "Good," Yara said. "They earned it." She set down the filing and looked at it again. In the Council's archive, alongside Preven's assessment of humanity's institutional instability, there was now a second entry. An emergency response record. 847 evacuees. 9 hours. 0 fatalities. Consistent with established standards. The archive was permanent. Both entries would be there forever. The full Council session convened on April 3, 2062, 5 years, 1 month and 12 days after Councillor Previn had entered his assessment of humanity into the permanent record. The agenda was substantial. There were 14 items for formal consideration, covering everything from trade route arbitration to the proposed expansion of council membership criteria. Item 7 was the one that had taken 18 months of procedural preparation, 3 rounds of multilateral review, and a final confirmation vote by 11 of the council's 17 full members to reach the floor. Item 7 was the formal petition from the human delegation for reclassification from observational member to provisional full member, the last status tier before a civilization could apply for full voting rights. Yara Osei sat at the human platform. It was no longer the smallest platform. Over the past 5 years, the Council's Facilities Management Office had 3 times reallocated platform space based on diplomatic activity levels. A mechanical, automated process that tracked message volume, meeting frequency, and co-participation in Council functions to determine each delegation's operational footprint. The human delegation had, quietly and without requesting it, grown large enough to require a larger platform. It was still not at the top tier. It was mid-level now, alongside the Surith hegemony and slightly above the Drell conclave, which meant nothing geographically and everything symbolically. Reinhold Vast was not with her. He had retired the previous year, returning to Sweden with a civilian commendation that he had accepted with characteristic understatement and a brief speech that had, by all accounts, been mostly about how little he had done compared to the younger diplomats who would carry the work forward. Yara had been at the ceremony and disagreed with his self-assessment entirely, but had said so only to his wife. Captain Sung-Ho Park, now promoted to commander and serving as the IDCC's senior council intelligence analyst, sat 2 seats to Yara's left. Dr. Fatou Bald, now 31 and running the Interstellar Translation Institute's council division, sat to her right. The team around her was almost entirely people who had joined the mission within the past 3 years, a generation of diplomats, analysts, and specialists who had grown up with interstellar reality as a given rather than a development. They were, on average, better prepared than their predecessors had been. This was not a criticism of the first generation. It was just true. The presiding arbiter for this session was not Marith. The Drell Elder had withdrawn from active council participation the previous year, a transition that the conclave described as voluntary retirement and that Fatou privately translated as something closer to completion of a cycle. The new arbiter was a Surith elder named Councillor Veyrath, whose appointment had been, according to the Surith channel, partly influenced by the events of the past 5 years. Veyrath opened the session with the formal invocation, 11,000 years of tradition, condensed into a ritual greeting that acknowledged all present species and affirmed the Council's founding principles. Yara had heard the invocation dozens of times. It still struck her every time that it was older than the Roman alphabet, older than the wheel. The 14 agenda items proceeded in order. When they reached item 7, Veyrath acknowledged the human delegation for the floor. Yara stood. She had prepared extensively for this moment. Not the speech. She had decided 3 weeks earlier that she would not make a speech. The petition was already in the record, fully documented, with supporting evidence drawn from 5 years of council interaction, emergency response records, treaty compliance data, and the formal assessments that multiple council members had filed about the human delegation's institutional performance. The record spoke clearly enough. What was needed now was not argument. It was presence. Arbiter Veyrath, Yara said. The sole delegation has submitted its petition for reclassification in full. We have no additions to the formal record. We are prepared to answer any questions the council wishes to put to us. She sat down. There was a pause. Councillor Previn of the Vethari Collective rose. Yara noted, from 5 years of learning to read Vethari body language, a skill that required significant cultural training since Vethari communication incorporated postural, chromatic, and subtle bioluminescent elements in ways that human observers rarely noticed without guidance. That Previn's posture was different than it had been in this chamber 5 years ago. The specific configuration was one that the Vethari cultural brief described as institutional engagement, a state of active, genuine attention rather than the formal performance of attention. The collective has reviewed the petition in full, Previn said. The record is extensive. We note the Verith Station emergency response, the KX-7 joint mission, the Interstellar Reliability Compact's 4 years of compliance documentation, the integration of human military assets under unified command, and the establishment of formal diplomatic frameworks with 7 council member civilizations. He paused. We also note the original assessment entered into this record on March 3, 2057. That assessment described the Sol species as characterized by fragmentation, historical aggression cycles, and institutional instability. The chamber was quiet. The collective does not retract assessments, Preven said. Assessments reflect conditions at the time of entry. The record is permanent and the record is accurate. Another pause. Longer this time. However, he continued, the Council's reclassification criteria do not require a civilization to have been perfect. They require a civilization to demonstrate, over time, measurable structural development toward interstellar reliability standards. Based on all evidence in the current record, the collective finds that the Sol delegation's petition meets the criteria for provisional full membership consideration. He sat down. Yara did not let herself react. But she was aware of Commander Park, 2 seats to her left, allowing himself a single, controlled exhale. The vote was not unanimous. 2 council members, smaller civilizations with complicated historical relationships to the admittance process, abstained. 14 voted in favor. 1 voted against, a delegation that had filed no prior communication with the human mission in 5 years, whose position remained opaque even to the IDCC's intelligence analysts. The motion passed. Provisional full member. Not full membership. Not voting rights. Not the final destination. But a reclassification. An official change in status, entered permanently into the Council's 11,000-year record. And directly alongside it, also permanent, also irrevocable, Preven's original assessment. Subthreshold. Institutionally unreliable. Category 2. Both entries would always be there. Anyone consulting the archive in 1,000 years would be able to read the progression, the judgment rendered, and then the response. Not the response of anger or confrontation or grand demonstration. The response of work. Sustained, documented, unglamorous institutional work, performed consistently over 5 years by thousands of people, most of whom would never set foot in this chamber and whose names would not appear in any council record. After the session, as the delegations filed out, Veyrath, the Surath arbiter, paused beside Yara's platform for a moment. He did not speak. What he did was extend one wing briefly, in the same gesture Tessavar had made 5 years ago in this same corridor. Noted with interest. The same gesture. But the context had changed entirely. On the transit shuttle back to the human mission hub, Yara opened her comm and called Geneva. It was early morning there. Vasilenko's office was just opening, his chief of staff Arjun looking characteristically unalarmed. How did it go? Arjun asked. We passed item 7, Yara said. Arjun wrote something down. I'll let the Secretary General know. Tell him also, Yara said, that the Vethari voted yes. Pause. Really? Arjun said. Really? She ended the call and looked out the viewport. Station Varanthus drifted in the dark between its 3 stars. 11,000 years old. Vast and old and, in its own way, capable of change, slowly, reluctantly, through the accumulated weight of evidence rather than through argument or force. Humanity had not won anything. There was no victory to announce, no adversary that had been defeated. Preven's assessment was still in the record. The work was ongoing. Full membership was years away, probably a decade, possibly more. The Council's internal politics were still opaque in ways that kept the IDCC's analysts employed. The KX-7 corridor was still contested in subtle ways. The Vethari relationship was normalized but not warm. None of that was the point. The point was this. 5 years ago, an ancient civilization had looked at humanity's documented history and said, clearly and officially, that it wasn't sure humans could hold themselves together. And humanity had, with no drama and no shortcuts, spent 5 years building the kind of institutional record that made that assessment increasingly difficult to sustain. Not by arguing. By demonstrating. Not by confronting. By performing. Not by being perfect. By being consistent. There was a long way left to go. Yara had always known that. She had known it in the chamber when she stood up to reply to Preven, and she knew it now, watching Varanthus grow small in the viewport as the shuttle pulled away. But she also knew something she hadn't been entirely sure of that day 5 years ago. They were going to make it. Not because humanity was exceptional. Not because they were faster or stronger or smarter than civilizations 11,000 years old. But because they had responded to being underestimated by doing the one thing that, in the end, no argument can replace and no insult can prevent. They had gone home and gotten to work. End of part 7, the insult that changed everything.